Donald Trump's claim that white South Africans were being persecuted over land reform sent shocks across the world. He threatened to cut U.S. aid, accused South Africa of human rights violations, and even offered asylum to white farmers. But to understand why his statements caused so much backlash, we need to look at South Africa's long history of land dispossession, apartheid, and economic inequality. This isn't just about Trump, because it's about centuries of power struggles and the unresolved fight for justice. In early February 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump issued an executive order halting all U.S. aid to South Africa. He framed this as a response to the country's newly enacted Expropriation Act of 2024, which allows the government to expropriate land without compensation under specific conditions. Trump claimed the law was discriminatory against white South Africans, particularly Afrikaner farmers, and offered them asylum in the United States, stating they were victims of persecution. His remarks fueled controversy, with some praising his stance, while others accused him of distorting the reality of South Africa's land reform efforts. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa swiftly rejected Trump's claims, calling them misleading. He clarified that the law was not about seizing land arbitrarily, but about correcting land ownership imbalances created by colonialism and apartheid. White South Africans, who make up only about 7% of the population, still control an estimated 72% of privately owned farmland, a legacy of past policies that excluded black South Africans from land ownership. The government argued that redistribution was necessary to create a fairer economic structure, insisting that land expropriation only applies to underutilized or abandoned land. Trump's comments sparked mixed reactions globally. Some Western nations and investors voiced concerns about the impact on property rights and economic stability, fearing that the law could deter investment. Others, particularly in Africa, supported South Africa's right to reform its land policies, viewing it as a long overdue effort to address historical injustices. The Democratic Alliance, South Africa's main opposition party, challenged the law in court, arguing that it violated property rights and could harm the economy. Despite Trump's claims, many white South Africans rejected his asylum offer. Some stated that they did not feel persecuted, while others argued that Trump's remarks exaggerated the situation. Within South Africa, some saw his intervention as an unnecessary attempt to interfere in the country's domestic affairs. Others questioned why Trump prioritized white South Africans over African refugees from war-torn nations like Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, who face actual violence and displacement. Trump's decision to cut U.S. aid added further strain to diplomatic relations. The U.S. has long funded health and development programs in South Africa, including critical HIV/AIDS treatment initiatives. The sudden withdrawal of financial support raised concerns about potential disruptions, but South Africa's government remained firm, stating it would not be pressured by foreign intervention. This debate highlighted broader land ownership, racial justice, and economic control issues. The next topic would be how white South Africans came to own so much land in the first place, and why land reform remains such a deeply contested issue today. European settlers began arriving in the late 1600s, establishing control over land that had long been home to indigenous African communities. The Dutch were the first to claim territory, led by the Dutch East India Company, which set up a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. What started as a trading post quickly became a full-scale colony, with settlers expanding their hold on land through force, pushing out indigenous Khoisan and Bantu-speaking communities. Over time, British and other European settlers followed, accelerating land grabs and solidifying white ownership. By the 19th century, violent conflicts between settlers and African groups were common as indigenous people resisted colonial expansion. Land was not just taken, it was a deliberate tool of oppression. The colonial government established policies that restricted black South Africans from owning land, forcing them into low-paying labor. At the same time, white settlers built large agricultural and mining industries on stolen land. One of the most devastating legal policies was the 1913 Natives Land Act, which formalized land dispossession on a massive scale. The law allocated just 8% of the country's land to black South Africans, despite them making up the majority of the population. The remaining land was reserved for white ownership, and black families were banned from purchasing or leasing land in most areas. This forced many into overcrowded reserves, often with poor soil and little resource access. When apartheid became official policy in 1948, land dispossession intensified. The 1950 Group Areas Act assigned different regions to different racial groups, with the best land reserved for white South Africans. Entire black, colored, and Indian communities were forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to segregated areas with inadequate infrastructure. Some of the most well-known forced removals include the destruction of District 6 in Cape Town and Sophiatown in Johannesburg, where families were evicted and their neighborhoods demolished to make way for white-only settlements. Even after apartheid ended in 1994, land ownership remained largely unchanged. The newly elected government, led by Nelson Mandela, promised land reform, but progress was slow. Many black South Africans who had been forcibly removed never got their land back, and the economic consequences of centuries of dispossession remained deeply entrenched. Today, white South Africans, who make up only 7% of the population, still own about 72% of privately owned farmland, keeping the land issue at the center of political and economic debates. Apartheid, instituted in 1948, was a system designed to entrench racial segregation and economic disparity in South Africa. Beyond enforcing physical separation, apartheid policies ensured that the white minority, particularly Afrikaners, maintained control over the nation's wealth and resources. This control was not limited to land ownership, but extended to key industries, labor markets, and political power structures. Black South Africans were systematically marginalized, forced into overcrowded and under-resourced townships, and denied fundamental rights, including land ownership in most parts of the country. The 1913 Natives Land Act had already confined black people to a mere 7% of the land, and subsequent apartheid laws further entrenched these restrictions. By the time apartheid ended in 1994, white South Africans, who constituted a small fraction of the population, owned the vast majority of arable land and held significant economic power. The transition to democracy in 1994 brought political liberation, but did not immediately dismantle the deep-seated economic inequalities. Efforts to redistribute land and resources have been ongoing but slow, often hindered by bureaucratic challenges and political opposition. The frustration over the sluggish pace of economic transformation and land reform culminated in the enactment of the Expropriation Act 2024. This legislation addresses historical injustices by allowing the government to expropriate land without compensation under specific conditions, intending to rectify the enduring disparities in land ownership and economic power. Understanding the economic legacy of apartheid is crucial to comprehending the contemporary debates surrounding land reform in South Africa. The systemic disenfranchisement of black South Africans created enduring socio-economic challenges that the nation continues to grapple with today. In January 2024, South Africa enacted the Expropriation Act, a law designed to allow the government to redistribute unused land to address long-standing inequalities in land ownership. The law was part of the government's broader land reform strategy, which aimed to correct imbalances created by colonial land dispossession and apartheid-era policies. The law specifically targeted abandoned, unused, or state-owned land that could be redistributed for agricultural and residential use. Officials clarified that productive farms, businesses, and occupied residential properties were not subject to expropriation, countering fears of land seizures without compensation. Despite these assurances, U.S. President Donald Trump condemned the law, portraying it as an attack on white South African landowners. He claimed the South African government was persecuting white farmers and warned of severe consequences. Shortly after the law was passed, Trump announced that the United States would halt financial aid to South Africa, citing human rights concerns. He also signed an executive order offering asylum to white South African farmers, positioning the U.S. as a refuge from what he described as an unjust policy. His administration framed the asylum offer as a response to an alleged crisis, though no widespread violence or persecution was linked to the land reform process. Trump's intervention reignited global debate over South Africa's land policies. His comments were celebrated by some conservative groups and far-right activists who had long pushed the narrative that white South Africans were facing a genocidal land grab. However, South African officials rejected his claims outright. President Cyril Ramaphosa dismissed Trump's statements as misleading and inflammatory, reiterating that land reform was necessary for economic justice. He argued that the new law was not about racial discrimination, but about undoing structural inequalities that had persisted since apartheid. Many white South Africans themselves did not accept Trump's portrayal of the situation. Interviews with white farmers and landowners showed that most had no intention of leaving South Africa. While some had concerns about how land redistribution would be implemented, they did not see themselves as refugees. Several prominent white South African organizations publicly rejected Trump's asylum offer, stating that South Africa was their home and that they had no desire to relocate. Some even criticized Trump's statements for exaggerating tensions and misrepresenting the situation. Trump's move also sparked reactions from international leaders. Some Western politicians echoed his concerns, warning that land expropriation could harm South Africa's economy and deter foreign investment. Others accused Trump of exploiting racial fears to score political points among his supporters. Many governments saw Trump's comments within Africa as an attempt to undermine African sovereignty, with several leaders backing South Africa's right to determine its policies without U.S. interference. Despite Trump's threats, South Africa's government remained firm. Officials stated that U.S. aid cuts would not derail their plans and that land reform would continue as part of the country's economic transformation agenda. The controversy surrounding Trump's response highlighted the global power dynamics in South Africa's internal affairs, with debates about land, race, and historical justice taking center stage. In December 2023, South Africa initiated legal proceedings against Israel at the International Court of Justice, alleging that Israel's military actions in Gaza constituted genocide against the Palestinian people. This marked a significant escalation in international legal challenges concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The South African government accused Israel of engaging in actions intended to destroy, in whole or in part, the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnic group. These allegations were based on reports of large-scale killings, serious bodily and mental harm, and deliberately inflicting conditions calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction. South Africa's application to the International Court of Justice sought provisional measures to halt Israel's military operations in Gaza and to ensure the protection of Palestinian civilians. In response, Israel vehemently denied the allegations, describing them as baseless, and accusing South Africa of acting as a legal proxy for Hamas. The Israeli government asserted that its military operations were conducted in self-defense against terrorist activities originating from Gaza, and that it did not target civilians intentionally. The United States, under President Donald Trump, reacted strongly to South Africa's legal action against Israel. In February 2025, President Trump signed an executive order cutting financial assistance to South Africa, citing the country's stance on Israel and its land expropriation policies. The order also offered asylum to white South African farmers, whom Trump claimed were facing discrimination due to land reforms. This move was criticized by South African officials, who argued that the land reforms were necessary to address historical injustices and that the U.S. actions were based on misinformation. Despite the international pressure, South Africa remained steadfast in its legal pursuit. The case garnered attention from other nations and international organizations, with some expressing support for South Africa's actions and others cautioning against potential geopolitical ramifications. The ICJ's proceedings in this case were expected to be lengthy, with potential implications for international law and diplomatic relations in the region. President Donald Trump's immigration policies have consistently reflected a selective approach to asylum and refugee resettlement, often influenced by racial and political considerations. In early 2025, Trump signed an executive order halting all U.S. aid to South Africa, citing the country's Expropriation Act 2024, which allows for redistributing unused land to address historical injustices. Trump characterized this policy as discriminatory against the white Afrikaner minority and offered them asylum in the United States. This move was widely criticized as being based on misinformation and for exacerbating racial tensions. In stark contrast, Trump's administration has demonstrated a lack of concern for Black African refugees facing severe violence and persecution in countries like Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. In February 2025, Trump indefinitely suspended the U.S. refugee admissions program, citing concerns over assimilation and taxpayer resources. This suspension led to the cancellation of travel for refugees worldwide, including 1,660 Afghans, and froze funds for U.S. organizations assisting refugees. The suspension has had devastating effects, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where it has disrupted vital HIV treatment programs and led to the closure of facilities for malnourished infants. This disparity in treatment raises critical questions about the motivations behind U.S. foreign policy and asylum decisions. Trump's offer of asylum to white South Africans, who are economically privileged and not subject to systemic violence, contrasts sharply with his administration's neglect of Black Africans enduring dire humanitarian crises. This selective approach suggests a racial bias, favoring white immigrants while disregarding the plight of Black refugees. Within South Africa, the issue of land redistribution remains a contentious and unresolved matter. Despite the end of apartheid in 1994, land ownership disparities persist, with white South Africans, who constitute about 7% of the population, owning approximately 70% of private farmland. The Expropriation Act 2024 addresses these historical inequities by allowing the government to reallocate unused land. However, implementing this policy has been slow and fraught with political challenges, leaving many Black South Africans awaiting meaningful economic justice. The international response to South Africa's land reform policies further complicates the situation. Foreign powers, particularly the United States under Trump's administration, have pressured South Africa, threatening economic repercussions and spreading misinformation about the intent and impact of the Expropriation Act. This external interference undermines South Africa's sovereignty and influences domestic debates, often diverting attention from the underlying issues of inequality and historical injustice. The struggle for fairness and equitable land distribution in South Africa is ongoing. How global powers engage with this issue reflects broader dynamics of power and racial politics. Trump's selective outrage and racially biased asylum policies highlight the inconsistencies and prejudices that continue to shape international relations and responses to human rights issues. What do you think about South Africans rejecting Trump's offer? Was he trying to help, or was this just another political move? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.